The Witch That Hovers Over My Bed. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. At 13 o'clock she comes for me. As reliable as the rising of the moon each night, the old hag rises above my bed when I try to go to sleep. Night after night, the terror is the same. Every night I walk down the hall, enter my bedroom, turn off the lights, and climb into bed, pulling the covers up to my mouth as if the bedsheets were a protective force field. I hope to create a safe space. Feeling safe and secure has become an alien concept. Rather than finding the warmth and comfort that is normally offered by one's own bedroom, I instead find that my room is permeated and disturbed by an unnatural feeling. A dark and heavy, sinister sensation surrounds me, and wraps me up like an evil blanket. It always feels like the diabolical, invisible blanket possesses a tremendous gravity. It weighs me down. This powerful dark force makes me wonder if it will crush me, open up a hole, and devour me. The oppressive, negative atmosphere has become a part of my life. It dwells in my room. It almost feels as if it's becoming a part of me. I'm not sure, but I suspect that it, whatever it is, wants to dwell in me and take control of me. Darkness is all I see. I no longer believe that I'll ever be free. In a dank, gloomy pit will I forever be. Even when I'm not in my room, this terribly wicked feeling returns whenever I think about these traumatic events. As soon as I think about her, that evil witch, goosebumps rise all over my flesh. When I close my eyes, her monstrous face haunts me. Even now, as I record my story, as I sit in the safety of my car, parked at my high school, I can't shake her off. She has her insidious fingernails hooked deep into me. As I tell you my story, I'm reliving the horror. Frack, this is insane. I'm 16 years old. I'm a linebacker on the varsity football team, and I'm perpetually scared. If this continues, I'm afraid that she'll either kill me, or I'll simply lose my mind. Maybe I've lost it already. If you saw her, and I hope that you never do, you would be a wreck too. In case the witch does kill me, I'm telling you my story while there's still time. Should I turn up dead, know that the evil hag was responsible for it. The witch always comes at night. When I am lying in my bed and the atmosphere in my room is heavy with fear, that's when she comes. It's always the same. I open my eyes even though I don't want to. I'm afraid of what I'll see, but I'm even more afraid of what will happen if I don't look. That's when I see her face, that horrific face of pure evil. Her skin is greenish and wrinkled. Wearing a black dress or a black robe, it's hard to differentiate in the low light. She floats above the floor, levitating a few feet off of the floor. She floats until she rises above my bed. Once she is above me, merely inches from the ceiling, she hovers there for what feels like forever. Her black, conical hat creates a shadow that looks as though a sword is emerging from her head. Her shadow seems to move and change into various, terrifying shapes, even though she is hovering in place above me. Filled with fear and the deepest dread, I look at her as I tremble. My heart flutters in my chest as my breaths become short and rapid. Her eyes, those awful, glowing, green eyes, stare at me. Her body is humanoid in appearance, and yet alien. Her face is withered, wrinkled, and has a supernatural green complexion. Monstrous. Her appearance is absolutely monstrous. Her flesh not only appears to be rotting, but she smells rotten too. She smells like a dead animal that has been left out for weeks in the hot summer sun. She smells so foul that it causes me to gag. The gagging adds to my anxiety as my throat begins to narrow and restricts the airflow to my lungs. Will I die of fear? Will I suffer cardiac arrest? Or will I suffocate as my throat closes? Being literally scared to death sounds crazy. Yet, my nightly visitations by the evil old witch aren't unique. Throughout recorded history, people have reported having similar horrific encounters. There are centuries of documented cases where an old hag sits on the chest of people as they try to fall asleep at night. Victims report finding it to be difficult to breathe as her weight sinks down on them. Modern psychology purports that these are nothing more than the phenomena of night terrors and sleep paralysis. The scientific explanation for this gave me reassurance when I first learned of them, but that comfort was soon torn asunder. During one of my nightly demonic visitations, the witch scratched my chest, and the red, bloody marks remained with me weeks after the attack. Now that I know that my nightly intruder is real, I'm constantly anxious. I'm always on edge. My fight or flight response seems to be permanently switched on, and it's exhausting me. The constant rush of adrenaline coursing through my veins leaves me feeling as though I've just finished sprinting in a race. Something as simple and ordinary as hearing the central air unit turn on stimulates a shot of adrenaline. Combine this with the precious little sleep that I get, and it's easy to see that I can't go on like this for much longer. If nothing changes, I will surely break down. Maybe this is what the sinister witch wants. As the hideous hag hovers over my bed at night, she repeats the words, "Let me in. Just let me in. Let me in, and this will all stop." The sinister tone of her voice always sends chills down my spine. It matches her demonic appearance. It's a terrible voice that I'll never forget, and sometimes I fear that it may well be the last thing that I ever hear. Whether I'm paralyzed by fear or by her black magic, I do not know. I only know that I'm unable to move when she comes. When I see her grotesque face, with its unnatural glowing green eyes, and I smell her putrid odor, I want to scream. Then I hear her hellish voice spew the words, "Let me in. Just let me in. Let me in, and this will all stop." I would writhe like a worm to escape her if I could. Unfortunately, there is no escape from her, and so instead, I writhe like a worm on the inside as my soul squirms where my body cannot. What's worse is that I have recently learned that the evil witch is now stalking my little brother, Stevie, at night. Stevie is 10 years old. He told me about the nasty old woman that comes to him when he goes to bed. My heart sank when he told me about this nightly visitation. I knew that it wasn't just his imagination run amok after hearing my stories about the old witch, because I never told him about her. He explicitly described her appearance as well as her rank smell. The details match up exactly with what I have observed. I don't know what to do. I want to protect my baby brother from the witch, but how can I protect him when I can't even protect myself? Who or what the witch truly is, I don't know. She looks like a witch, but looks can be deceiving. I guess that she could be a witch that mastered the art of astral projection, or she could be a ghost or a demon, or perhaps she's the ghost of a very evil witch. Whatever it isn't anything good. It is certainly evil. For a time, I had wondered if this was the result of living in a haunted house, but I don't think that that is the case here. My family has lived in this house for the past 12 years, and we never experienced anything that would have suggested that we had a ghost problem. More than that, I talked to some friends at school, and they shared their scary stories with me. As it turns out, a few friends from school have also been harassed by the sadistic witch with the green, glowing eyes. There are whispers that say that the evil witch came for Jackie. A week ago, Jackie, a junior, died suddenly overnight. Her friend said that she had become a fearful shell of herself, and that she complained about being attacked by an ugly witch in her room. After learning of these stories which matched my own, I searched the internet for answers. What I found was beyond troubling. All across America, there were news reports of people dying suddenly. Those who died suddenly varied in age from kids to the elderly. Various conspiracy theories attempt to explain what's going on, but one particular theory struck me to my core. The green witch with the glowing green eyes was described on various websites and across numerous social media platforms. The descriptions of the witch matched what I've witnessed to a T. Otherwise, healthy people are dying at the drop of a hat. Perhaps they are dying at the drop of a witch's conical hat. Time after time, death often seems to follow the people who have been tormented by the Green Witch. In other accounts, people say that those who have claimed to have been haunted by the Green Witch didn't die, but that they changed and became angry, violent, and psychotic. In all the accounts, whether the person died or became mentally unstable after encountering the witch, one thing was clear. No one seems to have escaped her without paying a grave price. Things are exponentially worse than I could have dreamed. I now see that the Green Witch with the glowing green eyes is a problem on a much larger scale and with a much larger reach than I had ever imagined. If she is haunting people across the country, then I can't simply sleep in a friend's house to escape her. She has potentially killed hundreds of people. It's quite possible that she has either possessed or driven hundreds of people, perhaps even thousands, insane. My blood freezes over as I think about the gravity of the situation. I feel like I've been pulled into a black hole, from which nothing can escape. Even now, as I finish telling you my horrific story, the Green Witch's sinister voice echoes in my mind. Let me in. Just let me in. Let me in. And this will all stop. Will I let her in? No. No way. Wait. I don't know. I'm so tired. I just want this to stop. Maybe I can make a deal with her. Maybe I can offer myself to her in exchange for leaving my brother alone. I know it all sounds crazy, but I have to do whatever I can to save my baby brother. I would do anything for my brother, but I can't forget that the witch, whatever she truly is evil, and evil beings cannot be trusted. Making a deal with her is foolish. If I could just get a good 10 hours of sleep, I would be able to think much more clearly. Time for me to get back to my house. What would you do if you were in my place? I pray that you never receive a visit from the green witch with the glowing green eyes. If I die suddenly, please don't forget what I've told you. I will do everything I can to fight the evil old hag and survive. But if I should die trying, know that it was no accident or some natural cause. Share this story, and maybe we can figure out the answers together. The truth is out there. My chilling beach trip to a haunted hotel. Have you ever felt a bone-chilling cold on a bitterly hot day? I have. I was frozen in the sweltering summer heat. It was the kind of heat wave that's not suitable for man nor beast. Simply standing outside for even 5 minutes could cause you to sweat through your short-sleeve shirt. The humidity that pumped in from the sea flooded the air. It was brutally oppressive. Yet I had been frozen in place. An unnatural chill crashed down my spine like a cresting wave crashes on the beach. I felt a unique kind of fear. It was the type of feeling of fear that you remember for the rest of your life. I wouldn't have believed it if it hadn't happened to me. It all began when we went on a vacation to the beach. My name is Kevin Jones, and this is my ghost story. I was 17 years old that summer. My parents were taking me and my younger sister Hannah on vacation. We normally went to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for our annual summer vacation, but this year was different. Mist of the Sea Beach in South Carolina was where we were headed. Summer vacations were a highlight of our year. We didn't have lots of money, so we only went on vacation once a year, and the trips lasted only about 3 to 5 days. Those glorious days of summertime fun were sealed into my memory. It's amazing how so short a period of time can stand out so much more than the seemingly endless monotony of day-to-day life. Mist of the Sea Beach was much smaller and less known than Myrtle Beach. My parents said that it would offer a quieter and less crowded experience. We lived in the Midlands of South Carolina, so any trip to the beach was always welcome. Unlike the Midlands, the low country of South Carolina offered a nice sea breeze, which made the humidity much more bearable. The beach there was beautiful. The sand was similar to the sand elsewhere along the Carolina shore, but the ocean seemed different. Perhaps it was because there were far fewer beachgoers, or perhaps it was because of the shape of the shoreline. Whatever the reason, the ocean somehow seemed to be more intimate. As massive and as majestic as the sea is, here it seemed as if it was just you and it. It was just you and the endless bluish-gray water that reached further than the eye could see. This beach rested in peace between Charleston, South Carolina, and Tybee Island, which was near Savannah, Georgia. The seclusion gave the impression that you were somehow stepping back in time. It seemed like a time in which everything moved slower, and humans hadn't yet developed and commercialized the beach into a theme park. Isolated as the Mist of the Sea Beach was, I had the sense that I wasn't alone. In fact, it wasn't long till each of us had a sense that we were never alone there. After spending our first day at the beach, we went inside our hotel room so that we could each take showers before we went out for dinner. My sister was going to be the first to take a shower, but we all took turns using the bathroom before she did. Isn't it something how swimming in the water makes you feel like you have to go pee? I used the bathroom first, and as I was washing my hands, I thought that I saw a person quickly walk into the shower. I saw it from the corner of my eye, so I didn't see any definitive shape. It was more of a shadow that quickly moved. As soon as I had seen it, it disappeared. I opened the door to the shower and saw nothing. No one was there. I dismissed it, thinking that it was nothing more than a product of spending hours in the bright sunlight and then suddenly going into a sunless room. The eyes needed time to adjust to the different lighting, I said to myself. After my sister Hannah had been in the shower for 20 minutes or so, she stormed out of the bathroom and said, "Kevin, not funny, you stupid jerk-face!" "What in the world are you talking about? Why are you so mad at me?" I replied as I waved my hands. "Why am I mad? Don't play dumb, doofus," Hannah answered while pointing her finger at me as if it was a loaded gun. Raising my eyebrows, I responded, "Look here, sis. I have no idea what you're on about." "Mom, tell that jerk to apologize to me. What he did isn't cool, and it's not funny. I'm almost 16 now, and I want privacy," said Hannah with ever-widening eyes. "Honey, please calm down and tell us what you are so upset about," said our mother in an even tone. "Ugh, I could just scream. He plays dumb and nobody does anything about what he did," said Hannah as her voice seemed to rise along with her hands as she lifted them over her head. "Honey, I know you're upset, but I think that you are upset about something that your brother didn't do," our mom responded after making a short sigh. "You always take Kevin's side. It's not fair!" Hannah exclaimed as her face became increasingly more red. "Hannah, that's enough. I'm not taking sides. Kevin couldn't have done anything because he's been right here talking to us the whole time you were in the shower," our mother explained with a sterner tone. "Come with me and take a look. Tell me then, who did this?" Hannah demanded. We walked into the bathroom, and written on the steam-covered mirror were the words, "Beware, beware, beware." It certainly was creepy, but I hadn't done it. Like Mom said, we were all talking to each other while Hannah showered. Dad, Mom, and I never left sight of one another in the time period in question. This caused my sister to believe that I played a prank on her, and we believed that she was messing with us. It wouldn't have been the first time that a family member played a practical joke on another. Although Hannah remained very annoyed, we all went out to the captain's kitchen for dinner. Later that night, after feasting upon delicious seafood, we returned to our oceanfront hotel room, stuffed, content, and exhausted from a long day of sun and fun at the beach. We headed to bed. There were 2 queen-sized beds in our room. Mom and Dad shared one, and Sis and I shared the other. She slept under the sheets, and I slept above the sheets on my side of the bed. Under different circumstances, we would have protested the arrangement, but we understood that we didn't have the money to book 2 bedrooms. Being as tired as we were, we didn't have the energy to complain anyway. All that mattered was that we were at the beach. Vacations to the ocean were the best. Around 11 o'clock was when we had all gone to bed. Later that night, I had awakened from a dream about a beautiful young woman. In the dream, the woman appeared to have been staying in this hotel. Her clothing and her hair looked like the style that was popular in the 1960s. I watched her walk over to the balcony as she gazed at the ocean with a look of gloomy despair. When I woke up, the feeling of deep melancholy from the dream remained with me. Along with this acute sadness was a cold chill. Goosebumps rose on my arms and legs. Fear began to rise through me like the sea rises during high tide. As this was going on, I became aware of an unshakable feeling that our family wasn't alone in our room. No, no, no! Help me! Somebody help me! Somebody please help me! I'm drowning! Hannah screamed as she woke up from a terrifying nightmare. At that very moment, we saw a pretty but very pale young woman staring right at us. She was floating 1 foot off of the floor in front of our beds. She was wearing a white bikini with some kind of white robe-like covering that was open in the front. The fact that she was floating above the floor wasn't the only unnatural part about her appearance. She also seemed ethereal or vaguely mist-like. The ghostly specter stared at us, and its mouth seemed to be screaming. Yet, not only did no words come out, but neither did any sound proceed from her lips. Highly agitated, this ghostly girl turned around and walked through the door. When I say that she walked through the door, I mean she literally walked through the door. She went right through the closed door like light shines through glass. Silence reverberated around the room as we remained motionless in our beds for a short time. Time felt like it had slowed down to a crawl. What was probably a few moments, or maybe a minute or two, seemed like an eternity. It turned out that all 4 of us saw the ghostly girl. The spirit looked exactly like the beautiful young lady from my dream. The only difference was that the ghost was pale and partially transparent. My sister explained that she had awakened screaming from a terrifying nightmare. She had dreamt that she was swimming in the ocean when a strong current had pulled her down the shore as it grew stronger and stronger until it plunged her beneath the surface. Her lungs filled with water. It burned as it felt as though the water hugged her so tightly that she couldn't breathe. No one had heard her screams, and she was powerless in the arms of the might of an angry sea. She explained that it had been the most vivid and realer-than-real nightmare she had ever had. The 4 of us didn't get any additional sleep that night. We talked about what had happened. We discussed different explanations for what had happened. Dad wondered if the 4 of us could have hallucinated on account of some bad food. I jokingly dismissed his suggestion by calling him Ebenezer Scrooge. Eventually we agreed that ghosts must be real, and we had just seen one for the first time. Creeping fear remained with us throughout the night. The night that we were visited by a ghost was a night that none of us would ever forget. Strangely enough, the story doesn't end there. Just because you may be done with the dead doesn't mean that the dead are done with you. After an early breakfast at a lovely restaurant, we ventured back to our room. We were there just long enough to change into our swimsuits and to get all of our beach accessories for the day. Not one of us wanted to stay in that room any longer than was strictly necessary. Once we got to the beach, we forgot the extraordinary and chilling events of the night before. It was as though the sun had melted all of our troubles away. Now it was time for sunbathing, walking along the shore, and swimming in the ocean. We were having the time of our lives. The day was hot, humid, sunny, and beautiful. An ocean breeze gave little comfort, but that was okay, because we had the refreshing 83-degree Atlantic Ocean to cool us down. The waves were considerably calmer than they were the previous day. Mom and Dad had gone for a walk down the shoreline. They loved walking down the shore, where the ocean waves became a gentle trickle on the sand. That place where dry sand meets water-laden sand always seemed magical to us. It was as though the ocean was alive, and it wants to wake the sleeping sand up to play. Wearing my blue swim trunks, I laid on my back to soak up some sun. With my eyes closed, the light of the sun still seemed to break through my eyelids in a way that caused me to imagine all kinds of wonderful things. It seemed as though the sun had the power to awaken my imagination. The heat of the sun enveloped me like a warm blanket. Absolutely exhausted from the night before, I fell asleep. Suddenly, I woke up from a deep sleep. Someone had poked me to wake me up. I looked around, but there was no one there. Turning my head, I scanned around to see where my parents and my sister were. No luck. I didn't see them. An icy cold chill went through me. That's when I saw it. The mist-like beautiful girl from my dreams was standing at the shoreline pointing towards the sea. There was a girl who was struggling in the water. There were no lifeguards there. My parents weren't there. There was hardly anyone on the beach at all. The distressed girl was wearing a red bikini. My sister had been wearing a red bikini. Then it hit me. That was my sister. My sister was thrashing in the water. Dear God, it looked like she was about to drown. Racing into the ocean, my heart beat rapidly like machine gun fire. I dove in the water like a seal and swam towards Hannah as fast as I could. My freestyle strokes pounded the water like the enemy that it now was. Channeling my anger and fear, I conquered the distance between us. Hannah had gone beneath the surface of the water shortly before I had reached her. I dove down and grasped her, pulling her up with all of my strength. The rip current was exceptionally strong. I could hear my father's voice in my head as I remembered what he had taught me. Son, listen to me. This is important. It could save a life. If you ever get caught in a rip current in the ocean, it's a really bad idea to try to swim against it. No matter how scary it might seem when the current gets its grip on you, never, ever try to overpower it and swim against it. Instead, swim with the current and follow it as it parallels the beach. That advice saved our lives that day. I held Hannah as we swam parallel to the shore until the angry sea loosed its indescribably powerful grip on us. With the rip current gone, we finally swam to shore and collapsed on the dry, soft sand. After several minutes, I began to make snow angels, or rather, sand angels in the sand, because I was so relieved and joyful now that my sister and I were safely ashore. The angel that day came in the form of a beautiful girl who happened to have been a ghost. A ghost saved my sister's life. When my parents, my sister, and I returned to the hotel, we asked some employees if this hotel was haunted. The hotel staff explained to us that not only did the hotel have a reputation for being haunted, but so did Mist of the Sea Beach. In 1969, a young couple came to the hotel that we were staying in for their honeymoon. The pretty young woman was 19 years old. The young wife shared the same first name as my sister. Her name was Hannah Stone. On a hot, beautiful summer day in July, she went into the ocean to cool off, while her husband fell asleep on the beach. The ocean seemed unusually calm that day. Waves were absent. The surface of the sea appeared as flat as a sheet of glass. So Hannah went into the sea without any concern. Appearances can be deceiving, though. Tragically, that was the case on that fateful day. The rip current caught a hold of Hannah, and it took her under. She drowned that day. Some of the residents of Mist of the Sea Beach say that Hannah was so beautiful that the lonely ocean wanted to keep her for itself. The hotel employees also told us that guests had reported experiences and sightings of Hannah over the years. Such reports seem to be more common when there is a powerful riptide along the shores of Mist of the Sea Beach. The spirit of Hannah lives on at Mist of the Sea Beach. Thanks to Hannah, my sister lives on in the flesh. Next time you go to the beach, remember Hannah, and remember my story. And always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there. Down in a Grave. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. A brooding Castabello sat shotgun as his partner, Marsh, drove the SUV. The tall trees blurred by as they drove to the next case. They had good reason to believe that a group of vampires had nested in a graveyard in the Hudson Valley. "Kono, it's been a while since you've been in the field. How do you feel?" asked Lydia as she glanced away from the road to look at her friend. The two friends and partners often addressed each other by their first names in private. Feel? How do I feel? What do feelings have to do with the case at hand? What you really want to know is whether I'm ready for duty or if I'm going to get you killed. Kono apathetically answered. No, I trust you with my life. I just want to know how you are. I know you've gone through a lot, and it's okay to not be okay. Sometimes it's good to talk about stuff, especially heavy stuff, Lydia said softly and tenderly. Trusting me with your life is a good way to get killed. Ask Agents Torres, Kipling, Fairchild, and Jones. Oh wait, you can't ask them because they're dead. Kono replied sardonically as he emptily stared out the window. Doubt swirled around Special Agent Kono Castabello's mind like dirty water circling the drain. Sorrow bred waves of depression, which in turn generated a storm surge of despair. Anger, frustration, guilt, and self-loathing inundated his soul. The weight was heavy and unbearable. The totality of his defeat at Bat Cave had broken him. The Master had thrashed him so severely that he had been at death's door. Good FBI agents were lost that day. The Master and his vampire minions had killed them in a truly horrific manner. Kono felt responsible for the whole disaster. The gruesome images and sounds from that day had been seared into his memory. Although the Master hadn't succeeded in killing Kono, he certainly had left his mark. It was as if he had branded him with evil. The typically calm, self-assured, optimistic, and witty Castabello was now anxious, self-doubting, pessimistic, and somber. This melancholy state of mind was quite alien to him. As an FBI agent, he knew that his current mental state was unacceptable for field work. He recognized that going out into the field in such a chaotic state would make him a danger to himself, to his partner, to his team, and potentially to civilians. In the line of duty, hesitation and doubt can be the difference between life and death. Even a tiny, momentary hesitation could cost him his life or the life of another agent. Law enforcement officers often speak of gut instincts and having a hunch. Kono had reasoned that instincts and hunches were the product of years of studying, on-the-job experience, and keen observation. For him, gut instinct was the result of the subconscious mind's lightning-fast processing of subtle clues and observations that the conscious mind wasn't aware of. Subtle details of someone's body language or tone of voice can give an investigator information that would normally go unnoticed without training and experience. Kono surmised that the mind analyzes such details even when the person isn't aware of it, and that the results of the silent processing manifests in the form of a gut instinct or a hunch. The human brain is a fascinating organ, and when it comes to understanding it, science is only in its infancy. Kono was so riddled with doubt that he even questioned his former understanding of the origins of hunches. The maddening cacophony of confusion was not without reason. Over the past year, a veil had been lifted and a whole new world had been revealed to him. Not only had he glimpsed a previously unseen reality, but he had been thrust right into the middle of it. He had always been a practical and rational person. He never attributed to the supernatural or superstition what could be attributed to the natural. Then he encountered Tut, the undead terror serial killer. Lydia Marsh, Moon Mist Division, a secret portal to another world, vampires, and the story of the Kaibo. From that point on, everything changed forever. Once certain things are seen, they can't be unseen. Coming to know that supernatural and preternatural things are irrefutably true means that the genie can't be put back in the bottle. After the threshold to the door of the paranormal has been crossed, there is no going back. Kono had never been an atheist. All of his life he had been skeptical without being a bona fide skeptic. After all, he had been named after Saint Kono, a Catholic saint. Saint Kono is a lesser-known saint that is the patron saint of a small town in Italy where his Italian ancestors were from. Having been baptized and raised Catholic from birth, he had always lived in a mysterious world. His world was a world with God, angels, demons, ghosts, and miracles. While he believed in the reality of such extraordinary things, he compartmentalized those beliefs. To his mind, those things had more to do with theology and faith than they did with everyday experience. He had never seen a ghost, an angel, or a demon, and he never expected that he would ever see such spirits. In a sense, he perceived two separate worlds. One was the real, everyday world in which everyone lived, and the other was the world of faith. These worlds weren't opposed to one another, but they were distinct. He thought of these worlds as essentially being two real places that often operated in the same space, but in different dimensions. That was a worldview that had served him well for nearly 3 decades. Then he crossed the threshold to the world of the paranormal, and the lifting of the veil blew up his understanding of the world. In a short span of time, he had been forced to face a new and true super-reality. This jarring new reality included the existence of immortal vampires, witches, magic, and mystical portals to other worlds. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, he learned that there was an ancient lineage of psychically powerful vampire hunters, and he was part of that exalted dynasty. Kono hadn't had the time to sufficiently wrestle with the implications of this new reality. Learning about vampires, the Moon Mist Division, and training in the ways of the Kaibo had eaten much of his time, and hunting vampires had eaten the remainder of his time. There was always another mission to go on. There was always another case to investigate. The past year had been a hectic whirlwind that had sucked him in completely. There had not been an opportunity to absorb the new facts, to contemplate the big picture, or to reshape a new workable lens through which to see the world. He had been so busy doing, rather than thinking, that these life-changing truths had been swept into a mental closet and left to sort out for some other day. That day didn't arrive until the aftermath of the Bat Cave incident. He hadn't chosen the day to address the ramifications of his strange new life. No, the day of reckoning had been forced upon him by fate. The spectacular defeat and humiliation that Kono suffered at the hands of the Master thrusted him into a terrible internal war. He was at war with himself. He questioned himself. He questioned his choices. He questioned his purpose. He questioned everything. As his body recuperated from the grave wounds inflicted on it by the ancient evil vampire, his mind waged an invisible battle. Unseen wounds often leave the deepest scars. Kono, Earth to Kono, this is ground control calling. Kono, are you there? Lydia asked as she waved her hand in front of his face. Yeah, I'm here, distantly replied Kono. You know, it's not your fault that those agents lost their lives. The Master and his demonic minions are at fault, Lydia assured him. Did the Master give the order to search Bat Cave? Was it the Master who had the trust of those agents? Kono asked as a sadness seeped into his voice. We made that decision to investigate the cave together. Director Glover signed off on the mission as well. As for trust, we are a team. We all trust each other. Unlike that filthy vampire lord, we make the choice to trust, whereas he compels his slaves to obey, Lydia responded. Well, then you had better rethink your choices. I'm not who or what you think I am. Everybody thinks that I'm some kind of superhero, but I'm not. I can't even save myself. Why should you think that I could save anyone else? Castabello questioned in an emotionless voice. Newsflash, you've only been aware of your Kaibo abilities for a little over a year. The amount of abilities that you have worked hard to use in so short a period of time is actually quite remarkable. That being said, there is so much more for you to learn. You will grow in your skills. Stop thinking that you have to be Superman. You have already saved lives. Without you, Adam would still be a prisoner of that fiend, said Lydia as she drove in the cold rain. Because of my weakness, you nearly became vampire food. That ancient evil scumbag nearly drank me dry. When I close my eyes, I could feel the painful sting of his bite, and I can smell his foul odor. Maybe, if I hadn't been so full of myself, people wouldn't have been killed, said Kono as he seemed to look beyond the road in front of them. In this life, everyone's safety is uncertain. And in this line of work, safety is even less certain, said Lydia. I don't know if I should be going with you to clean out the suspected vampire nest. I'm a mess right now. I know how important confidence is in field work. I have to be honest with you, Lydia. I don't trust myself. I'm not sure of who I am, and I'm afraid that I might hesitate when we're out there. An FBI agent cannot hesitate, and a Moon Mist agent absolutely can't hesitate. If I hesitate when a vampire's attacking, I might cost you your life, and I couldn't live with that. Frankly, I think I'm a liability out there, said Kono with an emptiness in his eyes. Stop it. Look here. Even if you're not at 100%, even if you're at 50%, that's better than most agents are at 100%. You aren't the only one who's been fighting with himself. It hasn't exactly been easy for me either. You don't have a monopoly on dealing with crap, Lydia replied. Oh, Lydia, the perfect one, is having a tough time, so I should just hit the magic reset button and get back to normal, right? What's a tough time for you anyway? Not closing every case in front of you? You're always annoyingly perfect and have it all together. Maybe you should just shut up about this, because you don't know what it's like to fall apart, said Kono in frustration. I've had a really miserable past few months. I've been second-guessing the decisions that we made that awful day. Then, that evil bastard turned my old high school boyfriend and sent him to kill me in my own home. If all that wasn't bad enough, the mall death stalker has broken out of prison. He was the serial killer that stalked and assaulted me when I was in college. All of that has triggered some serious crap. I've been an anxiety-laden mess. You've been too focused on your pity party to see it, but I've been in a perpetual state of fight or flight. I'm doing my best to keep it together, but it's exhausting, and it's taking all of my strength, Lydia said as her frustration finally boiled over. Look, Lydia, I'm sorry. I was out of line. I had no right to say those things. When I'm hurting, I have a bad habit of lashing out at anyone near me. You were right. I have been selfish lately. I had no idea that you've been suffering so much. What a fine pair we are, huh? Replied Kono with a half-smile. Although Kono didn't realize it, he had subconsciously picked up on subtleties in Lydia's behavior, and his mind had perceived her suffering. Somewhere in the deep hidden places of his mind was an anger that raged upon seeing a reflection of his own weakness and pain in his partner. Seeing what we hate about ourselves in others is often the cause of sudden anger. As mentally banged up as they were, they had to drive forward. There was too much at stake. Crawling up into a defensive ball wasn't an option. Besides, even if they did retreat and hide, they wouldn't be safe. The Master had targeted them, and they were very much in his crosshairs. They could run, but they couldn't hide. Someone had to face this vampire plague, and if not them, then who? The rain became heavier as they reached the cemetery in Middletown, New York. The sun was still up, and they searched the cemetery exactly as they had planned. They were not going to repeat the mistakes that they had made at Bat Cave. They searched the above-ground crypts for resting vampires. One by one, Castabello and Marsh entered and began to clear each of the crypts. Lydia and Kono shined their flashlights into the dark crypt. Silently, they both experienced flashbacks to the horrors of Bat Cave. Each footstep that they took in their muddy shoes made an eerie squeaking sound that echoed off of the concrete walls. Every step that Castabello took startled Marsh. She was on edge, and her heart beat like a drum. As anxious as she was, her training took over just enough for her to focus on the moment at hand. In fact, she used her anxiety and fear as a tool that gave her sharper perception. The adrenaline allowed her to see and hear more clearly wherever she directed her senses. Castabello slowly and steadily walked up to a brown coffin. Then he quickly flung it open. The ghostly white flesh of a recently deceased man rested motionlessly. Whether it was an ordinary dead body or a sleeping vampire, they couldn't be certain. This was New York, and above-ground crypts weren't as common as they were in New Orleans. The crypts in this cemetery were designed to temporarily hold the bodies of deceased loved ones until a proper in-the-ground burial could be held. To determine if a body was still human or had become a vampire, the agents used a handy method. They took out their smartphones and turned on the camera. If the body was seen through the lens of the phone, then it was an ordinary corpse. If, on the other hand, no body appeared on the phone, then they had themselves a blood-sucking vampire. Lydia raised her phone and pointed it towards the dead body. Castabello stood alert with a wooden stake in his right hand. She peered into the viewfinder of her phone and saw the pale-skinned, middle-aged man. He wasn't a vampire. She sighed in relief as her heart calmed down. That particular crypt was clear. As the rain eased, a gloomy fog began to set in. They were in the Hudson Valley, and it was not unusual for fog to settle in after a period of rain. The creepy fog rolled over the tombstones, and it enshrouded the crypts. A red fox called out in the distance. The pale fog in a cemetery is eerie on its own, but it's infinitely more eerie and unsettling when you're hunting for a vampire nest. It gave the atmosphere the classic monster movie feel, but this wasn't a movie. This was real. Marsh looked at Castabello and said, "Great. Fog again. Just what we needed. Why does it always have to be foggy when we're on the hunt?" Castabello shrugged his shoulders and answered, "I don't know. I actually like the fog. I find a certain comfort in it." Marsh rolled her eyes and replied, "Okay, Vincent Price." Side by side, Castabello and Marsh walked up a slight hill towards the next crypt. The fog caused them to look like two mysterious figures passing through a mysterious world. The sun hadn't yet set for the day, but they didn't let their guard down, because they weren't certain if the clouds and fog offered the vampires enough protection to wander outside. If the horror of the Bat Cave incident had taught them anything, it was that vampires can be active in the day if they are protected from the sun. Their hearts accelerated as they slowed down before the entrance of the crypt. Castabello nodded at Marsh as he opened the door to the crypt. This crypt held no coffin. It was empty. Once again, their hearts returned to a more normal pace. The fog thickened as the two Moon Mist agents walked toward the neighboring crypt. Castabello briefly thought that he sensed the presence of danger or evil, but he dismissed it on account of the fact that his feelings were all out of whack. The doubt, guilt, sorrow, and depression that he had been feeling clouded his mind. His judgment had become as foggy as the ominous landscape that surrounded them. Once again, Castabello nodded at Marsh and then opened the door to the crypt. Marsh went inside first, and Castabello then followed. The fog also followed them inside of the spooky crypt. Their hearts raced again. This time Marsh quickly opened the coffin as Castabello got his camera ready on his phone. A woman, around 30 years old, rested in the coffin. She had been very pretty. Her skin looked pale and smooth, but there was a disturbing hint of color. The color could have been attributed to the work of the mortician, but they wouldn't be sure until they checked the camera. Castabello took a heavy breath and pointed the camera at the young woman's corpse. The viewfinder was empty. Her body didn't show up in the camera. That meant that she cast no reflection in a mirror. Castabello yelled, "She's a vampire! Slay away! Repeat, slay away!" As Marsh whipped her wooden stake through the air, the vampire's eyes opened up. The undead fiend opened her mouth and hissed as her two sharp fangs glistened from the light of the flashlight. The stake crashed into the vampire's chest as blood sprayed onto the white walls. The tip of the stake had barely pierced the undead creature's heart. The vampire screeched in pain and fear as Marsh began to hammer the stake deeper into its heart. She wasn't going to stop until the stake went through the monster's heart. After 3 hard blows, the stake went all the way through the vampire's heart. Then, the undead body combusted in flames. Within several minutes, nothing but ashes remained. The fire had briefly burned incredibly hot as it intensely raged. Then it went out as quickly as it had roared to life. The life of the fire had marked the final end of the vampire. While they had hoped to find an entire nest of vampires sleeping the sleep of the undead, it wasn't a total loss. They had at least slain one damned creature of the night. Additionally, they had seen the layout of the cemetery by the light of day, and that would aid their efforts come nightfall. Castabello and Marsh decided that they would return at nightfall. The reports that they had received strongly suggested that there was more than one vampire prowling this cemetery. Though their advantage was lost at night, they had a task that needed to be completed. Castabello and Marsh left to go clean themselves up and to grab something to eat. They returned at around 11 p.m. Since it was nighttime and they didn't expect to come across any living people at the cemetery, Castabello switched his clothes. He had traded his usual FBI attire for his Kaibo vestments. He dressed not for an investigation, but for battle. The fog continued to enshroud the graveyard, just as death had enshrouded the bodies that were laid to rest there. Some bodies, however, were not at rest. Some bodies had been cursed as foul vampires. Lydia Marsh and Kono Castabello wore headlamps upon their heads. She carried a crossbow and he held a stake in his right hand as he kept his left hand free to use his Kaibo powers if need be. If the vampires were around, they would find the vampires, or the vampires would find them. As the Moon Mist agents walked through the dark and foggy graveyard, coyotes howled in the distance. The tension in the atmosphere was palpable. Castabello did his best to silence his doubts and suppress his fear. Vampires sense fear and anxiety. Those emotions, or the chemicals that cause them, are like catnip to a vampire. Walking around with depression, despair, anxiety, and fear is like chumming the water for these shark-like vampires. As Castabello and Marsh walked through the graveyard, they hadn't heard anything. It was dead silent. Suddenly, the sound of someone running was heard. Castabello and Marsh briefly looked at each other to affirm what each of them had heard. Then they moved their heads to shine their headlamps on the source of the sound. For an instant, they saw a dark silhouette rapidly move from left to right. They weren't able to keep the light on the figure. As they were focused on one area, the sound of someone running came from behind them. The agents whipped around and looked behind them. The beams of light from their headlamps frantically searched here and there. Still, they hadn't seen who or what was running in the graveyard. Marsh felt her heart thumping in her chest. Over the past few months, she had been on edge under normal conditions, but now she was under real duress. Her adrenaline pumped through her body. She had no intention of running. She was ready to fight, and she wanted to fight right now. Anger rose up in her like a sea monster rises from the sea. The sound of the pitter-patter of running feet came from the distance in all directions. The rushing footsteps drew closer. It sounded like they were being surrounded. Finally, the pale faces of their foes could be seen. Their dead, white skin blended in with the fog. These vile predators were on the hunt, and the agents were on the menu. There were 4 vampires, 1 man and 3 women. They snarled and growled as they began to close the circle around the 2 agents. Castabello raised his left hand, opened it, and then tightly closed it. He was trying to use his Kaibo powers to choke the vampire from a safe distance. Something was wrong. It had no effect. Nothing happened. Castabello was shocked. Since he had learned to use these abilities, he had never failed to use them at will. The red-headed female vampire charged toward him. He opened his hand, kept it flat, with his fingers pointed to the sky. It resembled the typical motion to stop or hold still. Yet again, it had 0 effect. The red-haired vampire crashed into him. The force of her attack made him fall backward into an open grave. He was 6 feet under. He began to panic. The inability to use his Kaibo powers was the last straw. He felt helpless and impotent. The red-haired vampire jumped into the open grave to finish Castabello off. His emotional meltdown excited her to the point of frenzy. As she lunged at Castabello, he screamed at the top of his lungs and violently drove the wooden stake into her body. He hadn't struck her heart, though. He had put the stake into her stomach, and he didn't care that he had missed the target. He was so filled with rage that he only cared about stabbing her again and again. He thrust the stake into her stomach 31 times. Each strike made the demonic creature scream and bleed. Finally, on the 32nd strike, he plunged the stake straight through her heart. The vampire exploded all over Castabello. Meanwhile, 3 vampires closed in on Marsh. She exhaled deeply, squeezed the trigger of the crossbow, and shot the male vampire right through the heart. His body spontaneously combusted. Marsh then pointed at the dark-haired female vampire and pulled the trigger. The wooden arrow hit the bullseye, and she too spontaneously combusted. In the blink of an eye, Marsh adjusted her sights onto the last remaining vampire and pulled the trigger. The arrow whistled through the air, but this time she missed. The vampire charged toward Marsh and knocked the crossbow out of her hands. The vampire then slapped Marsh with the back of her hand. The force knocked Marsh down to the muddy ground. Castabello tried to climb out of the grave, but he couldn't. Not only wasn't there anything to grab a solid hold of, but the grave was muddy. The more forceful he was in his attempts to climb his way out, the more he slipped. He knew that Marsh was in trouble, and he was unable to help her. Again, he felt powerless. His partner was fighting for her life, and there was nothing he could do to help. Dazed and with a bloody nose, Marsh began to pick herself up off of the ground. The vampire charged at her like a hellhound. As the vampire reached Marsh, Marsh used a judo move on the vamp. The move used the vamp's own speed, power, and momentum against it, and rolled it into the open grave. Castabello locked his eyes on the falling vamp, and thrust his stake through its unholy ribcage as it was in mid-air. The last vamp exploded into bits and pieces. "Hey, Marsh, are you all right?" asked Castabello. "Yeah, I'll live. How are you?" an exhausted Marsh asked. "Well, I'm down in a grave," replied Castabello. "Nothing to worry about then. Down in a grave, nothing matters," said Marsh with a delirious chuckle. "Maybe so, but I'm not ready to make this my permanent residence quite yet. So, give me a hand and get me out of this bloody pit," said Castabello as he wiped vampire remains out of his hair. Marsh found some rope and got him out of the muddy grave. Exhausted, they both laid in the graveyard for half an hour and laughed at the fog. Late that night, Cono Castabello wrote the following poem by the light of the fireplace in his home. Down in a grave, doesn't matter if you were brave. Down in a grave, doesn't matter what you gave. Down in a grave, there's no one to save. Down in a grave, nothing matters. In the eternal dank dark grave, no escape from this solitary cave. Forever inundated by a dark wave. Light cannot penetrate the abyss. Comfort in sadness you miss. Why am I here, crippled with fear, the loss of those that you hold dear? Why am I here? Evil is near. Dead alive, never to thrive. Down in a grave, doesn't matter if you were brave. Down in a grave, doesn't matter what you gave. Down in a grave, there's no one to save. Down in a grave, nothing matters. Ancient fog of war and death, for the living there is no rest. Fight and fight till your last breath. Never give up, surpass the test. When you no longer care, look up for the flare. In the brightness of hope, I'll meet you there. Pit of gloom, pit of despair, cannot swallow love that is shared. The Most Haunted Bed and Breakfast. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. The old colonial house always seemed out of place. It wasn't so much that the colonial style was different than the architecture of the new modern houses, but it simply felt out of time and place. Sometimes I'd look at that old house and think that it belonged in a different world. I couldn't quite put my finger on why I felt that way, but felt that way I did. The most recent owners had decided to turn the weathered house into a bed and breakfast. Since Coffin Falls, South Carolina, wasn't exactly a booming tourist destination, business was initially slow. Then, things changed. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence, began advertising that their bed and breakfast was haunted. They created flyers that read, "Stay at our dead and breakfast and sleep like the dead. Come see real ghosts." They handed those flyers out in Greenville, South Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia. They blasted social media with tales about their place. They really succeeded in creating a lot of buzz. Stories about their haunted bed and breakfast went viral. Before long, it became known as the most haunted bed and breakfast in America. Donnie and Betty Lawrence cunningly drew a steady crowd by exploiting the human tendency toward curiosity. The clever marketing proved quite successful. Tales of ghostly apparitions dressed in 19th century clothing appearing in the old house circulated far and wide. Other haunting stories also spread like wildfire. Disembodied voices, unexplained knocking on windows, doors, and walls were some of the extraordinary experiences that were claimed to regularly occur on the property. Like moths to a flame, people came. The ghost stories multiplied as eager paranormal investigators and thrill seekers became paying customers at the Dead and Breakfast. The guests reported experiencing a number of chilling events. One young woman told of a very unpleasant encounter. She claimed that something touched her inappropriately while she was in the shower. Another pretty young lady purportedly had been touched while she slept in her bed. Many patrons took to social media to share that they had seen shadowy figures and heard toilets flush by themselves. A number of people told of an unnatural and evil feeling in the atmosphere. One guest made and posted a video online about how they would never sleep the same again. This particular guest said that the Dead and Breakfast in Coffin Falls was pure, unadulterated nightmare fuel. The preternatural and supernatural fascinate people. One story became two, and two stories became hundreds. If each story was an unassuming snowflake, they soon transformed into a bomb cyclone of a blizzard. An avalanche of publicity rushed through all forms of media. Having been born and raised in Coffin Falls, I couldn't believe how my town had suddenly risen to national relevance. It was so very surreal. Coffin Falls, a small town in upstate South Carolina, had never been on the national radar. It may as well have been invisible. For most of us who lived there, that was exactly as it should have been. Quiet and peaceful. Isn't that the way small towns should be? The blasted haunted bed and breakfast changed all of that. I wouldn't be surprised if Coffin Falls has been forever changed. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't begrudge the success of others, much less the success of my neighbors. The thing is, there's something about that old house. My gut told me that there is truth to the plethora of stories about that place. If there's one thing that I've learned in my 31 years on this space rock, it's that you ignore your gut at your own expense. Gut feelings aside, There's another reason that I thought that there was something to the scary stories about that place. When my Uncle Paul was a kid, he stayed in that house for one summer. He used to tell me stories about how that old colonial house was haunted. He said that he had heard the water faucet in the bathroom sink mysteriously turn on and off by itself on numerous occasions. One night, he had seen a shadow man walk through the living room while he was sitting on the couch and watching TV. I always took my uncle's stories with a giant grain of salt, because he was a storyteller and a serial liar. Lies spewed from his mouth like a goose drops poop. He's notorious for lying, even when there is no advantage in doing so. Yet, some of his ghost stories from his time there track. His spooky tales match up with the various accounts about that place that are now flooding social media. Numerous ghost stories of the old house captivated the public's attention, but one story in particular really ignited the insatiable curiosity. Being an old house that had been built in the early 1800s, it had become run down and in need of significant repair. If the Lawrences wanted to open up a bed and breakfast, they'd have to pay for a great deal of work to be completed. Various plumbers, painters, and carpenters had worked in the house. One carpenter named Eric Dalton, a man in his 30s, never finished his work there. Mysteriously, he had vanished. One day, he had been seen entering the house, and later that day, no one could find him. He had disappeared. He had been missing for one day, then one day turned into 2, and 2 days turned into a week. His girlfriend had said that he had never come back home. That was very bizarre, because in the 2 years that they had lived together, he had never not returned home. In fact, he was a very well-respected carpenter, and he had never walked off a job prior to completing it. Thorough, professional, and quality were words that were associated with his work. The girlfriend of the missing carpenter filed a missing person report with the police. She revealed that her boyfriend had been working in that infernal house for several weeks, and his mental state had drastically changed during that time. He would come home from work and talk about that house all of the time. He told her how special that house was and how it was alive. An obsession with that house consumed him. According to her, hundreds of drawings of that house littered the walls of their home. That was very bizarre because Eric wasn't an artist. He didn't draw pictures as a hobby. The obsessive-compulsive drawings weren't the only strange behavior exhibited by Eric. As the days passed, his demeanor had changed. His girlfriend explained that Eric had increasingly begun to grow more distant. There were nights when, after he had come home from that house, that he'd sit at the kitchen table with an expressionless face for hours. Catatonic is the word that she used to describe it. Donnie and Betty Lawrence had searched their 2 acres of property for Eric, but found nothing. They allowed the police to go through their house, and they too had found no trace of him. Months had passed, and no one had seen or heard from Eric. The tragic disappearance of the carpenter had added to the haunting mystique of the house. Unsolved mysteries and ghost stories are popular, but when you combine the two, a mega-story may be born. All kinds of speculation abounded on TV shows, blogs, vlogs, across social media, and on internet message boards. Everyone seemed to have had an opinion on what had become of Eric, and they weren't afraid to declare even the most wild takes as fact. Some people had no shame, as they made outrageous assertions about Eric, his girlfriend, and his family. In the public eye, Eric and his family had ceased being real people. Instead, they were treated as though they were fictitious characters from a TV series. All of this did ensure that the old dead and breakfast in Coffin Falls would remain in the spotlight. It had reached a level of notoriety that rivaled that of the supposedly haunted house in Amityville, New York. Curious as I was about the supposedly haunted bed and breakfast, my gut told me to stay away. I probably would have stayed away if my job hadn't demanded that I spend a weekend there. Being a writer of a local publication called Spirit of the Upstate, I had little choice in the matter. Growing up as an evangelical Christian, I had been raised to believe that evil demonic spirits were real and that they were always on the prowl. It was a worldview that saw devils infesting and manipulating almost everything outside of our prescribed orbit. Although I had begun to question these things and walked away from the faith of my family, I didn't become an atheist. Striving to have an open mind led me to question things, but it also led me to not be overly skeptical. I believed in the possibility of paranormal entities or occurrences. Too many of my friends had shared spooky ghost stories with me, and, at the very least, they genuinely seemed to believe that what they had experienced was real. The world is a very strange place, and I don't doubt that there are fascinating things that we haven't yet discovered or begun to comprehend. The possibilities of all the amazing things that are out there fascinate me. Yet, even though a stay at the purportedly most haunted bed and breakfast in America seems like an irresistible opportunity to encounter a spirit, my intuition screamed at me. My gut told me that there was danger in that place. So, because I wanted to keep my job, I agreed to spend a weekend at the house that had captured the imagination of the whole country. Writers are lucky if they can make a living off of smithing words. I had certainly been very thankful for the ability to make a decent living doing what I loved. I was willing to take some risks in order to make sure that I would continue living my dream. Really, was my boss's demand unreasonable? How dangerous could a house be? On Friday, the 14th of April, I arrived at the Dead and Breakfast. Even though the Lawrences spent a large sum of money on renovations, the white paint on the outside of the house was very chipped and aged. It seemed apparent that they had purposely left the outside of the house looking ancient. As a result, the house looked like you would expect a haunted house to look. As I walked toward the front door, a foreboding feeling washed over me. The house looked as alien as I had remembered. I knocked on the front door. Donnie Lawrence opened the door and greeted me. "Welcome to Coffin Falls Haunted Dead and Breakfast. You must be Leo Kingsley, the writer." Smiling, I said, "Yes, sir. Guilty as charged. This is some place that you have here." Donnie's brown eyes widened as he smiled and responded, "Yes, it sure is a hell of a special place. What kind of story are you planning on writing about our historic home?" Briefly considering the question, I gently bit my lower lip and answered, "Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure yet. I've come here with an open mind, and we'll see how things go. I don't have any expectations." Donnie laughed and replied, "The thing about this place is that you don't need to have expectations in order to experience something unusual here. The vast majority of our guests have reported having paranormal encounters. If you stay the whole weekend, I'd be very surprised if you don't witness some ghostly activity." Smirking, I responded, "That sure would be interesting. I'll keep my eyes open." The eyes of Donnie Lawrence narrowed as he replied, "Oh, it would be very interesting. Word of caution, though, the spirits here aren't known to be friendly. It is a good idea to keep an eye out while you're here." After that strange greeting came to an end, Donnie showed me to my room on the second floor of the house. My room was painted red. Unlike the chipped paint and semi-dilapidated look of the exterior of the house, the interior was in good condition and very well kept. A queen-sized bed with black sheets and an orange comforter rested against a wall on which hung a spooky old black and white photo of the house. Though the room was well adorned, I couldn't shake the feeling of pure negativity. The air in the room felt like it was weighed down. It's a very difficult sensation to describe adequately. After I had settled in is not the right choice of words here, because I didn't feel at home. I thought about how I was going to spend my time in this place. I had decided that I would talk with Donnie and Betty Lawrence, walk around, and see what I could see. Donnie and Betty Lawrence were young. They looked to be around my age. Donnie, like me, was around 6 feet tall. He had shiny black hair, and he wore it in a ponytail. His wife, Betty, had shoulder-length red hair. Her eyes were a very pretty shade of green. She was short in stature, but her presence was dignified and commanding. I had gone into the kitchen with them to get some coffee. The three of us took our coffee cups and walked into the living room and sat by the fireplace. "Betty, what's it like living here?" I asked as I sipped my coffee. "Well, it's certainly different. I never feel alone here. I like having a house that has lived a little," Betty replied as she giggled. "This house has a lot more history than the average house, that's for sure. I wonder what its walls have seen," I remarked. "Why don't you ask them?" she asked as her lips slightly curled. "Right, I should have thought of that. This place is kind of alive, at least if the stories are to be believed," I responded after I briefly laughed. "This place is alive. Its history speaks to us. The past residents here never left. They remain with us. I'm quite sure that they are watching us now," said Betty as she studied me. "Have you all actually seen a ghost? A full-bodied apparition?" Donnie and Betty nodded their heads in the affirmative. Donnie crossed his legs and said, "Oh yes, I've seen the apparitions of several of the ghostly residents. I've seen a woman dressed in 18th century clothing walk right through the front door. I've also seen a man wearing a top hat walk down the stairs and then dissipate into thin air. Then there's a black shadow that appears and disappears. The shadow has the shape of a man, but something about the shape seems inhuman." Chills shot down my spine. I looked at my hosts and said, "Wow, it sounds like there's a tremendous amount of activity here. Thank you so much for allowing me to record our conversation. I will definitely play this back later and reflect on it." The three of us continued to talk for another hour. They shared many ghostly experiences with me. Their accounts sounded fantastic, but I got the sense that they were telling the truth. I'm pretty good at reading people and sniffing out BS, but I didn't detect any BS here. Yet I couldn't help but think that they were hiding something. They were very polite and pleasant, but I sensed that there was some kind of darkness that was hiding within them. I couldn't put my finger on why I had gotten that impression. They were delightful, and yet, much like the house, something seemed off. After we concluded our conversation, we walked back to the kitchen to put our cups in the sink. I couldn't believe my eyes. The chairs had been stacked up on the kitchen table. Pots and pans were spread around the room. Some pots were on the floor. Some pans were on the top of the refrigerator and stove. This was not how we had left the room, and we had been together the entire time since. The odd occurrence had taken me aback. I wondered if someone else had done this. I didn't jump to any conclusions, but I was aware that a normal explanation existed for this bizarre scene. A ghost wasn't necessary to accomplish this. Betty told me that this had happened here from time to time. Later that evening, when I was in my room, I played back the recording of the evening's conversation. A third of the way through the recording, I heard something that made the blood in my veins run like an icy river in Alaska. I half expected the spiritual equivalent of a polar bear to maul me. I had heard a voice on the recording that I hadn't heard during the conversation. The voice didn't belong to Donnie or Betty. The apparently disembodied voice said, "We have such delightful plans for you." I couldn't come up with an ordinary explanation for the sinister-sounding voice on the recording. It wasn't the kind of fuzzy, unclear evidence that you usually see on TV paranormal shows. This recording was crystal clear. My strange experiences didn't end there either. Over the weekend, I had heard knocking on the window to my room. When I looked to see what it was, there was no one there. A ladder would have been needed to reach my bedroom window, and I didn't see a ladder. I had tracked the sound of footsteps as they climbed up the stairs, walked down the hallway, until they approached my door and finally sounded like they had arrived at my bedside. Yet, I didn't see anyone there. On another occasion, I got out of the shower and discovered a message written on the steam of the bathroom mirror. The message read, "We're watching you." Brave is certainly not a word that I would use to describe myself, but it took all of my willpower to stay in that house for the entire weekend. If my job and potentially my writing career hadn't been at stake, there's no chance that I would have remained there past that Friday night. An evil presence was with me throughout my entire stay at that so-called haunted dead and breakfast. Although I was truthfully terrified while I was there, I was lucky to get out unscathed. Over the year that followed, 3 dead bodies had been found at the old house. The coroner concluded that all 3 deaths were homicides. It seemed that a serial killer had been targeting patrons of the notorious Dead and Breakfast. News of a serial killer hunting victims at the most famous haunted house in America added fuel to the raging inferno of national interest. Sensational stories like this captured the imagination of the nation. Rather than being frightened away by the real deadly danger, many clamored to stay at the house. Some wanted to solve the serial killer case. Others believed that ghosts or demonic entities were really responsible for the 3 deaths. The police had suspected that Donnie or Betty Lawrence were responsible. Police were surveilling the house when an officer saw a man in a hoodie climb under the house. The officers followed him, handcuffed him, and took him to the police station. They determined the identity of the suspect. He was Eric Dalton, the carpenter that had gone missing. Eric had been living in the crawl space of the old house. He had built a secret passage into the house. He climbed up from the crawl space and entered the house undetected. He had stalked guests, played tricks on them, and eventually he escalated to murder. Police determined that he had also killed 3 other people at different locations. His victims ranged from 16 years of age to 67. 4 of his victims were female, and 2 were male. Everyone that stayed at the haunted Dead and Breakfast could have ended up dead. While many of the strange events that took place at the house could be attributed to Eric Dalton, not everything could. Eric couldn't have been responsible for that voice that I had picked up on the recording of my conversation with the Lawrences. What of the footsteps that I had heard by my bed at night? Was it Eric who had visited me and wrote a message on the bathroom mirror while I showered? The door had been locked. Still more curious are the other stories that have a link back to that diabolical house. No less than 20 people that had stayed there developed serious clinical mental illness. 8 of them went on to commit murder, and 3 of the 8 became serial killers. Did the house attract mentally unstable and violent individuals, or did it make them become that way? My research shows that, much like Eric Dalton, none of them had a prior history of mental illness. None of them had criminal records. Now that Eric Dalton is in prison, the haunted Dead and Breakfast remains open. It's the most infamous haunted house in America, maybe even in the whole world. Books are being written about it, and I have no doubt that TV series and movies will portray the haunting events. The tragic deaths of those innocent people have increased the macabre legend. I believe that the story isn't over. That house is evil, and evil never really dies. I hope that you enjoyed your stay here at the Haunted Half Moon Inn. The Master requests that you consider supporting me and the inn by becoming a patron of mine on Patreon. The Half Moon Inn needs your support to keep the doors open. You wouldn't want the residents here to feel forgotten and abandoned, would you? Creating quality scary stories to share with you is very important to me. Running this inn of horror is a passion of mine, and I would truly appreciate your support. The world is hurting. It needs more horror. Help me to heal the world through horror. Together, with your help, we could haunt this world one home at a time. Until next time, always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there.